The British author G.K. Chesterton wrote, "Education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to another." If we were to examine the soul of public school education in America, what would we find? Reading and math scores might be used to set funding levels, but what about the harder to measure values such as fairness or responsibility? Is there a place for moral lessons in the classroom? And if so, how do you teach moral lessons while respecting constitutional rights to freedom of speech and religion? We discuss the role of morality in public education today on The Professors.
From across the city and the 7 city colleges of Chicago, broadcasting from 63rd and Halsted at Kennedy King College. Professors take the art of conversation to a higher degree.
Thank you for joining us. I'm C.M. Winters Palacio from Malcolm X College. Joining me today are Professors Antonio Vasquez from Wright College, from Malcolm X College, Edward Davis, and Pamela Canamore from Kennedy King College. Welcome all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So, morals. Does morals have a place in public education? What do you think?
I think definitely that morals has a place in public education. I think as educators, we teach morals whether or not we explicitly write it on the board and share it with our students, but I think our lifestyle should come across to the students and we model the behavior we expect.
Now, some would say they would do a gross generalization and they would look at some of our young people today and say, well, if that's the case, then public education has dropped the ball. Antonio?
Well, I would say, coming from my angle in economics, one of the things that we'll talk about quite frequently is the issues going on in the day about our public debate on our budget. And we always have the trade-off between efficiency, that is making the economic pie as big as possible, versus equity, a fair distribution of it. And I find them quite engaged in the idea that if we're going to cut government spending, that we're going to see things such as their grandparents maybe not getting the full benefits of their medication through Medicare Part D, that if we do have an outcome where Social Security is really underfunded, that their grandparents and parents could be living together, leading to all sorts of additional issues and issues of care for them as they age, and that they understand that, and they do understand that there's a moral implication to our budgetary decisions, which has been in the news quite a bit recently. And they're very engaged in it. They do care.
Edward, let me ask you this. Now, we know morals, it's about just teaching just the proper conduct of what's right and what's wrong, right? And as it gleans from our society. So, whose morals should we be teaching?
Well, this is something very interesting. If we think about just the history of the United States, at one point in time, it was morally acceptable to have slavery in the United States. Is this morally acceptable today? We'd have to say no. At one point, it was morally acceptable for us to have Jim Crow and segregation in the United States. Is this morally acceptable today? Certainly not.
So let me ask you this then. So how do you go about teaching morals without promoting values? Or can you teach morals without promoting certain values?
I would say the values are definitely embedded within the context of that society, and they value both in time and within geographic area. Because you can see that in terms of, like, as he discussed, Plessy versus Ferguson in the Supreme Court, where separate but equal was okay in the South, but wasn't really a major concern in other parts of the U.S. So in the same time, 2 different geographic areas. And there is a geographer that talks about the importance of geography. It determines your religion, which therefore determines your particular outlook and moral values. If you're born in the Middle East, then you tend to be Muslim, or you'll be in the West, you're going to be Judeo-Christian. If you're in Asia, you're Confucian. And so those are embedded in those societies, and they're part of their distinctions, their values, and their morals are set around that.
Now, I think commonly in our in the American culture, morals and religion are kind of interdependent upon each other. But what happens when it's not in a religious institution, i.e. the public school?
I think in terms of with morality and even ethics, because I teach speech communications, and we have a whole chapter on the ethics of communication and ethical speeches. and what does ethics mean? And I think, as Antonio shared, that morality is embedded within the topic of ethics, embedded in socialization, embedded in just behavior that should be accepted or approved. And the question about whose morality, I think the law books certainly have given, well, there are tons of law books out there that started with the 10 Commandments, right? And from those 10 Commandments, we have libraries full of lots of precepts on the books now regarding what is acceptable, what is not acceptable behavior. And I think it's some simplicity, because we started with, well, what is right, what is wrong? And those gray areas are not really gray areas, I don't think.
Well, I'd have to say, from my own academic disciplines of African American studies and anthropology, I often, with my students, look at marginalized communities, the oppressed, or the wretched of the earth, right, as Frantz Fanon would say. And we have to really look at the ways in which people are socialized within these systems that marginalize them. And if they are marginalized, then is that system that oppresses them one which is moral, one which is just? In our own legal system in the United States, we do have a space for protest, for people who might find some sort of oppositions to the laws that are written, so that laws can be corrected, our Constitution can be amended over time, over centuries. It's been amended so many times. So we really have to look at this question of morality as not just whether or not there is a right or wrong in some sort of binary or dualism, but we have to really look at that gray area, the middle, that large middle section, right? And think about exactly what it means to the majority who don't fit into that top 10% or the bottom 10% who might espouse one particular position or another. How can we really be fair to the masses, to everyone?
And to continue on the legal aspect, we are now seeing and observing a clash of cultures, and that as you see a large migration of Muslims to Europe and the US, you see the advent of Sharia law being imposed within their communities. And that's based on their values. And now we're clashing the two legal systems under which the things that are being done under Sharia law are considered immoral and inappropriate according to Western law. So this is a very important issue that we're seeing played out in the headlines, and our legal system will have to address it eventually.
Now, when we talk about morals, a lot of times, as we were seeing, there's the growing trend to kind of not necessarily, well, I would say distance ourselves from using the language of morals, because it's so tightly fixed with the word religion, even if it's just in marketing purposes, just the way that we've been socialized. And so there's this rise in character building. Edward, you want to talk about that?
Right. I think it is interesting how different schools in the United States have character development curriculum as a way to really address these issues of morality or the ways in which students conduct themselves from day to day. As we said earlier, the ways in which we might see certain morals or certain values and mores are really embedded in the ways in which we socialize our children, in the ways in which we model certain behaviors. But with character development curriculum, a particular theme might be addressed in a month or in a week's curriculum, such as fairness or cooperation or responsibility, building teamwork. And in these different types of themes and characteristics rather, that are expounded upon, students are able to understand these differences as far as multiculturalism and diversity are concerned. So let's say you take a state like North Carolina, where character development curriculum is pretty much practiced across the board. In North Carolina, we also have to remember the history of Jim Crow, you have to remember the history of slavery and segregation, and this is the space in which kindergarten through 12th grade students with their teachers can discuss these issues in a very healthy environment and also move towards some sort of some sort of fairness within understanding how to interact with other people of different cultures.
I fear that our conversation, we're still being general. We're just talking about morals. Let's see if we can drill down just a little bit further. Would you say that in a public school system, Chicago public schools, there may not be a moral code, right? But there are rules of conduct?
Yes.
Is that the same?
Mm-hmm. There are rules of conduct in Chicago public school systems. I had an opportunity to be a CPS teacher, and there is a manual. Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right. There is a code of conduct, an expectation of the students, the parents, the staff, everyone has a role that they should play. And I think that that morality piece is embedded in code of conduct, that there are some consequences in the event that you do not follow the code. And so the code was developed so that the children can learn a sense of morality, a sense of socialization of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable.
But I wonder sometimes, will the students, and speaking in general, will they lose the message because it's embedded in the curriculum? It may be demonstrated per se, but there is not really a direct module in the curriculum that says, okay, this semester we are talking about morality.
No, not directly, but just as Edward shared earlier about the character education.
But have we been too indirect? Some people will say, well, have we been too indirect in trying to teach morality, and maybe we should take a more direct approach? Because some would say, people are running amok. You know, we're looking at the certain violations that are going on Wall Street. We talk about all of the immoral behavior that has resulted from greed, from the housing, you know, the mortgage crisis. Have we been too indirect for too long?
Well, I would say we've had enough crashes over the history of Western financial instruments, back to tulip mania and the Dutch, where people were paying 10 years worth of income for a little tulip bulb, to the South Sea bubble. That fear and greed is always there and is always driven. One thing that did happen as a result of this situation in 2008 is that Canada came away relatively unscathed. And one of the things that was written about in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperative Development, they said was the regulation of the Canadian bank system and its nationalization of the banks. That is, not in the sense of the government owning them, but they had to have branches in all states. So that this kind of regulation imposed sort of like an external morality on them, let's say, and that kept them from going in and abusing the credit markets and giving people loans that they could in no way afford, and also lead to that real estate bubble. So that in that case, government did have a role, and it did go in and impose a set of strict standards, and it did impose a morality, and it had a benefit for that particular economy.
And I think if we just look at this issue in the United States, in the recent crash from the 2007-2008, we really didn't have, in this country, we didn't have much of a government regulation as far as what went on at Wall Street. And this could be linked to just the ways in which American capitalism has developed, as far as someone in the free enterprise system would definitely benefit from the sufferings of someone else. You capitalize on the sufferings of someone else to a certain degree. And we have to really look at that sort of moral code embedded within our economic system, which values that particular type of exploitation of the rich against the poor. If this is embedded in our overall economic system and the way we interact with each other economically and socially, then what does this mean in terms of how we interact with each other on other levels, politically and so forth?